Well, in part one, a few months ago, we saw how Vasa was built, why it was built, and effectively the situation that led up to the circumstances of its setting sail on its maiden voyage, from which, of course, it didn't come back. But there's an awful lot more to the story of Vasa than just that. There's, as it went down, how it ended up in the state that it ended up in, how it got salvaged, what was found aboard, what its actual capabilities could have been, all sorts of things. And we're going to look at a little bit more of its history today, continuing again with our interview very kindly provided by Dr Fred Hocker, the Director of Research at the Vasa Museum. So, without any further ado, let's get on to what the expert has to say. So, obviously, when the ship has gone down and it's considered lost, we look at it now. You can look at the Mary Rose, and there's about a third of that left. Look at maybe something like the Newport ship, and there's bits and pieces of that left. I think there's a little bit more of the Bremen cog around, but that's mostly the underside. Whereas when we look at Vasa, it's pretty much all there. So how did that end up? How did it end up basically in one piece when practically everything either side of it that sunk has ended up as scattered fragments or bits of hull?
Right. Well, Vasa was very lucky in where it sank. In salt water, there are macrofauna, you could say, that eat wood. The most well known is Teredo nivalis, although there are other species of Teredo as well that do that. Shipworms that will destroy wood that is exposed to the water very quickly. There's also a crustacean, Limnoria lignosa, gribble, that will do a lot of damage. Plus there are microscopic organisms, bacteria, erosion bacteria, that eat away the cells from the inside. That's why what's left of ships in salt water is what gets buried quickly, so those organisms can't live. There's a lot left of the Bremen cog because it was buried in mud relatively quickly, so it's preserved right up to the deck. It's in quite good shape. Mary Rose is much of the starboard side because it heeled over to that side, and that side got buried. Vasa is about a little bit more than 98% complete, at least up to the level of the hull. We also have the lower foremast and mainmast complete, and a few yards and a lot of other bits of the rigging. And that's because the conditions in Stockholm Harbor are particularly good for the preservation of organic material. And that's because the water is cold, fresh, and polluted. That the temperature is about 3 degrees Celsius year-round where the ship sank. The salinity is very low. It's virtually fresh water. And the things that eat wood need salt water and warmer water. And then because the water is polluted, there's no oxygen at the bottom. It's an anaerobic environment, and the bacteria that would eat the wood at the microscopic level need oxygen. And so the bottom of Stockholm Harbor is effectively dead. Nothing grows there. And so there was really nothing to eat the ship. There's a little bit of bacterial damage, not much. What we see in terms of damage is mostly man-made. After the ship sank, it was not considered lost, it was only considered underwater. And so there was a contract given to an English engineer, Ian Bulmer, directly after the ship sank, who he believed he could get the ship up. It was sitting on the bottom at an angle of about a list or a lean of about 20 degrees. And he managed to get it up right again, but he couldn't break it free of the mud. And there were several other attempts into the 1630s to raise the ship without success. By the 1660s, it was accepted that the ship itself was no longer salvageable, but it was known that there were 64 bronze guns on it that had cost about twice as much as the ship had, and they were still valuable. And so there was a privilege or an opportunity given to some entrepreneurs to recover guns, and using a diving bell, they managed to recover most of the ship's guns and sell them. In order to do this, they tore up the upper deck. They probably also are the ones who took the masts down in order to get their diving bell into the middle of the ship. But they laid the masts carefully next to the ship instead of disposing of them, so we still have those two. And so we're missing the planking of the upper deck where they ripped that up to get at the guns below. But they didn't do much more damage than that. Then there is some erosion of surfaces that were exposed to the water. The ship sank into the mud up to about the waterline. And then once the nails corroded through very quickly, everything that was nailed on fell off. That's most of the sculptures. And they landed in the mud where they were covered and protected so well that a lot of them still have paint on them. But those parts that stood up in the water, well, the harbor of Stockholm is a river. In fact, the name of it is the stream, Strömmen. And it's the outflow from an inland lake. And so it's a steady current full of sediment. So it acts like a low-grade sandblaster. And so it gradually eroded away the original surface of those parts of the ship that were above the mud. And so we've lost maybe 10 or 15 millimeters in some places of that original surface. But because the timbers are so large, it doesn't make a substantial difference to their strength. In the 19th century, there was an anchor dragged through the ship, which demolished the stern castle, but didn't carry it away. It just broke it up and it ended up lying on the bottom in pieces. And then in the 20th century, there were loads of blasting rubble from construction projects around Stockholm that were dumped on it that did a little bit more damage. One of those rubbles was dumped here in this cabin, for example. A big load that demolished what was standing of this cabin and crushed it down onto the deck. But otherwise, the timber is all there, and generally speaking, in very good shape.
And presumably they didn't know they were dumping a bunch of rock on top of an old warship.
Correct. People knew, there was knowledge of people who worked in the harbor that a big ship had sunk, approximately where, but not exactly where. And the people who were dumping blasting rubble didn't care. So.
And with that preservation, we've obviously been looking around the museum, there's an awful lot of other material that survived inside the ship, which is stuff that you wouldn't see, I think, practically anywhere else. I've been to the Mary Rose Museum. They've got a lot of leather, they've got a lot of wood, and some bone and pewter that survived. But there's things here like the short jacket coat thing. If you hadn't told me that was an original piece, I would have assumed that's a replica because it looks like it's in that good a condition. Now, granted, some of the things like the sails are not in such great condition, but considering that they were probably a lot rawer material compared to the clothing, that's not necessarily a surprise. But how much have we learned from all this preserved material of the ship about life aboard the ship, life in early 1600s Sweden compared to what we knew without the ship?
Well, the conditions of preservation are very good for organic material generally. So things like wood, leather, and cloth survive quite well in the bottom of Stockholm Harbor. Conditions are terrible for metal. We have almost no iron remaining other than cast iron because of its carbon content, and the anchors because they're just so big that they hadn't corroded away yet. So our collection of tools, for example, we have about 250 woodworking tools from the ship. About 200 of those are sticks about this long. They're the handles to things like axes and adzes. The heads have simply disappeared. So that's where other ships, like Mary Rose, still has iron objects surviving in recognizable forms that we simply don't have. But organic preservation is very, very good. The timber objects, the wooden things, are not very badly decayed. Even the paint on their surfaces survives in a lot of cases. We have good preservation for leather, very good preservation for certain types of cloth. Animal-based fiber like wool and silk survives very well underwater. Plant fiber, cotton, linen, doesn't survive as well. We're fortunate that we have an utterly unique find in the form of 6 of the ship's sails, plus the 2 sails for the ship's boat in recognizable form, but mostly because they were well down in the hull and they were very quickly buried. Other places in the ship, our textile finds are mostly wool and silk. So we have wool jackets that are missing the linen linings. The majority, and altogether we have about 40,000 finds from the ship. 9,000 of those are lead musket balls from the ammunition. Another 4,000 are copper coins. small denomination. If you added them all up together, they wouldn't have paid the captain's salary for the summer. But the majority of the material that we have are the personal possessions of the crew, really. We don't know how many people were on board, but something around 150 people probably. And a bunch of them had brought on chests or boxes or barrels or sacks with their spare clothing and other personal possessions. And that's a lot of what we have in the collection. So we're able to say a lot about the people who were on board the ship. And because the Swedish Navy was mostly manned by conscripts rather than professional mariners, what we're looking at is a cross-section of Swedish society from the land, not specifically necessarily maritime people, but farmers and townspeople who have been conscripted into the Navy. Because the Swedish Navy also allowed sailors to have their wives on board as long as the ship was in home waters, we not only have men, we also have women. We have the skeletons of 15 to 17 people, and 2 of them are women, because they would be a normal part of a ship's community in this period in Sweden. So we have a pretty good cross-section of Swedish society, not just a ship's company. And from that material we can learn a lot. We have a big project that we've got going on right now looking at all the clothing and shoes. It's about 12,000 individual fragments of cloth and leather. And what we realize is this is the largest collection of ordinary people's everyday clothing in the world from before 1700. All from one context, all of this in use at the same time. And so we can say a lot about how ordinary people dressed. And these are the people who don't appear in historical documents. Nobody writes down what kind of clothing a peasant owned. Or what kind of shoes he wore, that kind of thing. So we learn a lot about the lives of ordinary people because of all of this material. We also learn a lot about how the Navy manned its ships by seeing who these people are, looking at the skeletons to get some sense of what's the demographic of the crew. And these are the kinds of things that you can't find from other sources. You need to look at the people and their possessions themselves.
You mentioned when the statues fell off that they still had some of their paint left aboard. Now, obviously, we have the standard sort of trope that you see in a lot of films set from the medieval period, pretty much all the way up to the Victorian period, where everything is varying shades of brown. And this is very obviously not the case with the Vasa. The ship itself is mostly brown because it spent hundreds of years underwater. But the actual statuary and other features, when they've been recovered, they actually show quite a range of colour to them. So was that typical across Europe, or was that something specific to Sweden or to a region? Obviously, if we've been mentioning Sovereign of the Seas a few times, we know that we're covered in gold leaf practically everywhere. This ship has some gold leaf, but nowhere near that kind of level, but it's a lot more colourful. So where does that sit?
Well, the Vasa is an example, a slightly late example of the Renaissance style that we call Mannerism. It's a style that uses polychrome, so very bright colors, sort of extra natural colors, you might say, that in a very vibrant, even garish sort of approach. And this multicolored or polychrome approach to ship decoration had been typical all over Northern Europe through most of the 16th century. We can see in Baker's manuscript from 1580 in England, where he does watercolor renditions of a number of ship designs. They're all very brightly painted in multiple colors. Kind of the English tended to follow a scheme of dividing the ship into square panels by horizontal and vertical elements and having painted scenes in those panels, or using heraldic images and that sort of thing. And so Vasa is in that same tradition of very brightly colored and polychrome. And that really didn't start to change until the 1630s with Sovereign of the Seas. Sovereign was a departure in England from what had come before. The idea of basically a single color background, some dull dark color, dark blue, black, and then gilding in contrast to that against that black background. It's a very impressive, very elegant and stately look. And if we even look at ships late in the sailing ship period, like Victory, Victory's combination of black and that buff brown color is derived from Sovereign of the Seas and that gold on black background idea. And that you can't afford to gild every ship that early, but you can paint it yellow, which will create. And there were ways to use ochre and orpiment and pale yellow paints to create the impression of gilding at a distance. So that black and yellow or dark blue and yellow combination became a long-standing warship tradition after the 1630s. But up to that point, it had been, the polychrome had been the way to go. And it survived well into the 17th century in Dutch ships. If you look at paintings from the Anglo-Dutch Wars, you can immediately tell the English ships from the Dutch ships because of the color schemes. And it survived in Sweden until the 1660s, when the Swedish Navy started employing English shipwrights and adopting English fashion in ship design and decoration.
I guess it shows again how much of a confluence point Vasa represents, because appearance-wise, it's got a lot more in common with the gun decks and the general layout with Sovereign of the Seas, which is a bit later, but looks-wise, colours-wise, it's got more in common with the Mary Rose, which is a much earlier vessel with the coloration.
Right, and in terms of the color, but Mary Rose had virtually no sculpted decoration on it. It was painted on a flat background. And what you see in the 17th century is that polychrome painted tradition is then supplemented by three-dimensional sculpture. We can see it at the end of the 16th century. We start to see the first appearance, and then an explosion of it all through the 17th century of this proliferation of carved work, even on merchant ships. You think these people are counting the cost of everything, but it's still an important part of shipness, of being a ship. If you want to, as a merchant, communicate to the world you're a successful merchant, your ships have carvings on them. And so it becomes part of how you express the identity of a ship, is this profusion of carved work. And then the painting tradition changes as you move from Mannerist Renaissance into a Baroque idea. And then in the 18th century, the level of carved decoration tends to get reduced gradually until you see something like Victory. If you look at Victories, though, you still see there's a lot of carved work on the stern in terms of foliage and fruit and figures around the stern. But then at the beakhead, you're seeing much more plain moldings, very much in the Georgian style of furniture, you can see. But then you still have elaborate figureheads being carved in the 18th, early 19th century, until by the later, by the time you get well into the 19th century, you're very, very plain, much more functional looking in a way that also is part of that communication of the ship's purpose. That once you get to the iron navies and the steel navies and steamships, they go for a very different aesthetic, but it's still an aesthetic. There's still people who care about how those ships look and the impression they give.
When the ship went down, do we know roughly, I know we said we know roughly how many people were aboard. Do we know roughly how many people got away? Because obviously there were a number of skeletons found, but presumably someone who maybe got caught in a net on the upper deck, the body might have drifted away over time.
Right.
Do we know roughly how many people were actually lost with the ship?
We do, and not roughly, we know fairly accurately. There are 4 different contemporary accounts that talk about how many people died. It's interesting, they follow the same pattern we see today in disaster reporting. If you think about 9/11 or the apartment building that burned in Britain.
Grenfell, yeah.
Yeah, Grenfell. What you see there is the very first reports say it's a big disaster and we have no idea how many people died. And then you start to see people trying to estimate. Well, we know there were 4,000 people in the building, so it could have been that many, but we don't. And then people start to show up. You start to be able to count noses of people who are alive. You go into the wreckage, you can start counting dead bodies. And so that number gets refined until eventually you get to there's a final number for how many people died on 9/11 that's quite specific. Well, the same thing happened with Vasa. The very first report, the day after, when the council wrote to the king, who was then in Poland, the ship is sunk, but we don't know how many people have died until we can have a muster, until we can count. And then there's a report from a Danish spy, Krabbe, who wrote back to his spy masters in Denmark and reported that he had heard that 50 people had died, 50. And then there's a report from an English agent, James Spence, who wrote back to Charles I's government, and he reported that he had heard that 40 people had died. And then about 2 weeks after the sinking, a member of the council ruling Sweden wrote to his brother, who was the chancellor with the king in Poland, who's very specific, and he said 30 people, including women and children. We can double check his math because he also reported how many guns were lost and how deep the water was. And we can see that he was correct for both of those numbers because there's an inventory of how many guns were on the ship when it sailed. And his number matches up pretty well there, and he gets the depth right. He was also in the best position to know, after 2 weeks of stragglers showing up, injured people dying, that sort of thing. So when he says 30, we're pretty sure it's right around 30. Of those people, we have the skeletons of at least 15, somewhere between 15 to 17, plus isolated bones that could represent another few people.
So just over half.
Right, and the reports of the sinking say that most of the people who died because they were trapped in the ship. The ship sank relatively quickly, but it was only 120 meters from shore on a warm summer day. And so a lot of people swam ashore. If you couldn't swim, even after the ship came to rest on the bottom, the masts were out of the water. So you could hang on to something until a boat picked you up. So we think they were right that most of those people were trapped in the ship who died.
And once the ship had gone down, obviously it had briefly been the flagship.
It had been a flagship.
A flagship.
The Swedish Navy was divided into 3 squadrons, each of which had a flagship. Okay. And this was the command ship for the reserve squadron based in Swedish waters at that point in the campaigning season. But there were 2 other ships that also had flagships.
Okay, so did its loss, being a fairly substantial vessel, did it markedly affect the flow of naval warfare that Sweden was involved in at the time, or was it kind of sort of one of those inconveniences that happens, but we can shuffle everything around to make good?
Well, Gustav II Adolf was always quite fortunate in his timing, and he lost a lot of ships to accidents in the 1620s. The Swedish fleet was about somewhere between, at any point, between 30 and 40 combatants, plus a lot of auxiliaries. But in the course, just in between 1625 and 1628, 18 of those ships were lost. 10 in one storm. Vasa is one of 3 ships lost in accidents in 1628. Only 2 of those were lost to enemy action in the one naval battle of Gustav Adolf's reign in 1627 off the coast of Poland. Because of the way Gustav Adolf was using his navy in the years that followed, the loss of Vasa really didn't make any kind of significant strategic difference that we can detect. It was embarrassing, of course, but it doesn't seem to have made a difference in how the king planned his campaigns that we can detect.
Okay. And sort of coming to the other end of its stay on the bottom, what was the process for finding it and bringing it back to the surface? Was it kind of a national thing of we want to bring this back up as part of our history, or was it sort of one person's like, oh yeah, well there's this ship, I'd find it because that's what I want to do? Sort of, what was the motivation and how did that all come to pass?
Well, the modern Vasa project started with one person, much in the way that the Mary Rose project started with Alexander McKee. That Vasa started with a private citizen who was a civilian employee of the Navy named Anders von Sane. He was an engineer, fuels and lubricants engineer. And he was interested in the Navy's history. And he set himself the task of trying to find the wrecks of 12 famous ships that had sunk in the 16th and 17th centuries. And he was slightly ahead of the game because 3 of them had already been found in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And he knew people who had been involved in those projects. And so he started searching for Vasa in 1954. And he started out by talking to a history professor who told him where to look. The history professor was wrong, because the history professor was reading secondary sources from the 18th century about where the ship had sunk, not primary sources. The ship had never been forgotten. There was always this knowledge within the Navy about the loss of Vasa. It was always used as a cautionary tale. Don't let this happen to you. But in the winter of 1955-56, several things all happened. Francine realized he needed to do more research himself. So he started looking in the National Archives for the primary accounts of the loss, which all pointed to a different place. They all say the same thing. They say exactly where the ship sank, to within 200 yards. And he came in contact with the Navy's chief salvage diver, who knew the bottom of Stockholm Harbor reasonably well. And he was given a new chart of the harbor that had been made that year, because there was a plan to build a bridge across the harbor, the lower part of the harbor, that would have run right over the spot where Vasa lay. And so he was given a very detailed chart of soundings that had been made in the summer of 1955. And they showed a very distinct hump in the bottom. It was about 6 meters taller than everything around it, and about 50 meters long. And when he asked about that, he was told by the engineers, oh, that's the blasting rubble from when they were building the docks on Beckholm. But when he talked to the salvage diver said, well, not the 1920s construction, because we dumped that somewhere else, but it could be from a 19th century docks. Maybe we ought to look there. And so, and it's where the accounts said the ship sank, in front of Beckholm. And so they started looking there, the 2 of them. And in the course of in the late summer, on the 25th of August, 1956, they were using a drag, a small grapnel towed behind the boat, and it fastened into something. And then they used a coring device, basically a weight with a punch in the end of it, and it brought back a sample of black oak, waterlogged oak, very old oak that had been underwater a long time. And so they moved over 20 yards, 20 meters, and then got another plug of black oak that indicated, okay, the big hump on the bottom here is a wooden structure. So that was enough for the 2 of them to persuade the Navy to detach diving assets. And they sent a small diving vessel and 2 divers who dived on the site about a month later and discovered it was a ship sitting on the bottom, a ship upright and intact with 2 full rows of gun ports. There was no other ship of that size that sank in the harbor in that area. There are other big warships in the harbor. There are a whole bunch of them that were used as a foundation for a bridge about 10 years after Vasa. We know where those are too. So that was enough to create the project. At that point, the real genius of this was not in finding the ship. It wasn't really lost. The genius was Francine's ability to persuade people that this was a worthwhile project. His enthusiasm was so infectious that he managed to persuade the Navy, the National Heritage Board, the National Maritime Museum, and the biggest private salvage company in Scandinavia to all contribute their resources to raising the ship and making it the centerpiece of a museum. None of them would have done it on their own, and none of them would have done it if Francine hadn't sold the idea. He also managed to get the royal family involved, so the court was behind it, and the king assigned the most popular member of the entire royal family, Prince Bertil, to be the head of the foundation that would raise the ship. So it got a lot of publicity, it got a lot of popular attention, just at the moment when Sweden's modern economy was taking off. A lot of historians refer to the 50s and the 60s in Sweden as the age of possibility. The people dreamed big. Massive redevelopment of the city of Stockholm, construction of the modern expressway network, expansion of the rail system, all sorts of things. And so the idea of raising an ancient ship was not considered lunacy. The government got behind it. The Navy did all the diving. The National Heritage Board agreed to conserve stuff. The National Maritime Museum agreed to provide historical expertise. There was some opposition. There were a few politicians who were opposed to money being spent on this instead of making people's lives better. The same sort of people who are opposed to the space program and things like that. But generally speaking, it wasn't a very big drain on the public purse after it had been recovered. And then the state took over the task of preservation. And so the Navy transferred ownership of the vessel, which it owned by the right of sovereign immunity, to the National Maritime Museum in 1964. And the foundation that had been set up transferred its assets to the National Maritime Museum, and they became responsible for conservation. So they paid for the process of preserving the ship.
And so I remember when I was very small going to Portsmouth and seeing Mary Rose and being a little bit disappointed that it appeared to be a gigantic warehouse full of mist through which you could see the occasional timber emerging as infinite amounts of glycol were sprayed everywhere. What was the preservation process for Vasa? Obviously it's not being sprayed with glycol now, but...
Right. The method that was used on Mary Rose is a development of the method that was pioneered on Vasa. Polyethylene glycol had been developed by the forest products industry. They thought it was a way that you could stabilize green timber and use it immediately rather than having to go through the curing process, saving time, money, etc. It ended up not being used for that, but the chemical ended up having all kinds of other uses. You and I are wearing it right now. Mm-hmm. It's a standard ingredient in shampoo, lip balm, McDonald's milkshakes, Hershey bars. I mean, there's all sorts of uses for it. But it can be used to stabilize wet wood. And so the method that was used on Vasa is the same one that was later used on Mary Rose, which was to spray it for long periods with a solution of PEG and water, gradually increasing the concentration as the ship absorbed the PEG. The method used on Vasa was fairly crude compared to the method used on Mary Rose. Mary Rose was able to take what had been learned from doing Vasa, develop it into a much more effective application method. But the basic method was to spray it with polyethylene glycol. In Vasa's case, it was sprayed for 17 years, so a little less than they did on Mary Rose. And then slowly dried to an ambient humidity of initially 60%. Now here in the museum, it's about 53%. And that method replaces the water that is bulking out the cells with this water-soluble wax. And as that dries, it stabilizes the cells rather than letting atmospheric pressure crush them.
And so it doesn't just all come to pieces as it dries out. And
in Vasa's case, that PEG only goes in about 2 centimeters into the surface. That the core of the wood is still in sufficiently good condition that it's not penetrable.
Oh, okay.
And so it's surviving on what remains of its original strength, which we estimate from tests to be somewhere around 50% of its original strength.
And then it was brought into this museum. Was the museum built around the ship, or was it brought to the building?
How did we get the ship in the bottle? Mm-hmm. That's what we call that question. The museum is built over an old dry dock. You'll be interested because it was a dry dock built for the first generation of armored warships in the Swedish Navy in the 1870s, after they went from monitors to proper, what they call pansarbolte. And the Navy had outgrown it. It was really a little too small for anything that they were then still using it. But this was a Navy base. And so the Navy said that could be used for the museum. And so the museum building was built over it, but leaving the wall at the open end of the dry dock open. And so the ship, after it had been raised, had been refloated on its own keel initially for about a day to get it onto a concrete pontoon so it would be possible to move it around within Stockholm afterwards. And it sat on that pontoon all through the conservation process. And then once the shell of this building was more or less finished, in December of 1988, the pontoon with the ship on it was moved from the conservation lab and then floated into the museum. The dry dock was closed and drained, and a bunch of concrete pilings had been built in the bottom of the dry dock, and the pontoons settled onto those, and then they built the last wall of the museum. Closed the interior space so it's watertight, so we can't flood it again. and then subdivided the pontoon. The ship still sits on that pontoon, and it's our main storage area for collections and furniture and the wine cellar for the restaurant and everything else.
So there is another level below.
That's the first floor. The bottom floor of the museum is actually the second floor. The first floor is inside the pontoon. There's actually a zero floor, which is the space in the dry dock under the pontoon, which is about that high.
Yeah, probably not the best to explore.
It's interesting. It's all the climate plant is down there, for example.
Mm-hmm. So with the museum as a whole, obviously it's here to display Vasa and the artifacts that are found with it. At the moment, at the time of filming, obviously it was closed because of the current COVID. But for people who might want to now come and have a look at it once it's all reopened, are there any sort of tips you'd give for visiting the museum? Good times of the year to visit normally? How long should you allow for it? That kind of thing.
In normal times, we are open 365 days a year. We're not closed on Mondays or holidays, so come anytime. We are busiest during the summer, June, July, and August. That's very much because of cruise ship traffic into Stockholm overloads us. So it'll be a very crowded museum if you come in the summer. But it's a big place. We can take 2,000 people at a time. If you come outside of the summer months, any time is good. Outside of the summer months, we also have evening programming going on in the form of lectures or other events, not just running around the museum. I think that people ought to budget about 2 hours at a minimum if they're coming on their own, if they want to see everything we have to offer. We have a restaurant in the museum, and so you can build your visit around having lunch here. And that restaurant is open for most of the time that we're open. Gets good reviews as a restaurant. We are normally open. Our open hours for most of the year are 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. In the summers, we have been open 8:30 a.m. to 6 p.m. And in the winter, we're often open until 8 p.m. Before the COVID crisis, we were looking at changing those hours because of our increasing visitor numbers to accommodate the large number of visitors we were getting. I don't know what's going to happen once we reopen permanently, once tourism settles down again. Presumably there'll be a vaccine and we'll be able to return to some kind of a normal life. So I can't really predict that yet. But it'll probably be something like that. So if you think in terms of a 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. opening time, we're always open that amount of time. And you can come any day of the year that you like.
Okay.
Our admissions policy is that we have one price for adults and children are free. That is our current pricing policy.
Sounds all fairly reasonable. I've been looking through the artifacts in the museum and elsewhere in the video. Obviously, I'll be looking at some specific ones and talking about those. But of all the things that have come off of Vasa that you've looked at, what would you say, do you think, is sort of the best or your favourite artifact?
I would say my favorite artifact is whatever group I'm studying at that time. But there are several things that I come back to fairly often. We have one group of objects that are unique, and that's the sails from the ship. They just don't survive in other places. You have most of a set of 17th century sails. I've often said virtually everything else that we have on the ship, you can find a better one at the museum next door. Our next door neighbor is the Nordic Museum, which is the museum of basically folk life in Sweden. And so they have cups and plates and bowls and lanterns and furniture from the same period as Vasa that hasn't been underwater for 333 years. And so it's in better shape. What sets the collection of Vasa apart is the context. It all comes from one moment at the same place. And the ship. The ship is also unique. And I came into this I was a wooden shipwright before I was an archaeologist. And so I'm fascinated by the ships themselves. So I always come back to the ship as the center, and it's the centerpiece of the museum. Other things that I find interesting, right now we're working on the clothing and the shoes and realizing how comprehensive that collection is. and that it's unique as a record of the everyday clothes of ordinary people, the people we don't see in royal palace collections of coronation robes. I think that's fascinating. That's an interesting collection on its own, outside of the context of Vasa. And the occasional individual object that I find intriguing. Recently, I've been looking at a sundial, a little pocket sundial about 5 centimeters long, and it's been possible to identify who made it because it was a standard model for one particular maker in Nuremberg, and then that lets me reconstruct the missing bits of it because I can take the whole ones that are in other collections, figure out how it was used, why somebody on board might have it. And that leads me into an entire story about how did you tell time in the 17th century, or how did you navigate a ship in the 17th century? Who would have owned an object like that? Would have been moderately expensive. So why did they have it on board? Another object that we've looked at recently that I really have enjoyed is one chest of one person's belongings. To look at all the stuff that this one guy thought that he was going to need on board the ship. And so there's a pair of shoes, a pair of overshoes, a pair of mittens, a really nice hat. This is all the stuff he wasn't wearing when the ship sank. He had something else on when the ship sank. Plus, he had the parts for another pair of shoes already cut out, and a shoe last. So either he was a shoemaker, or he was prepared to take it to a shoemaker to have another pair of shoes made. He had his sewing kit with him, a ball of silk thread and a little blob of wax to run the thread through, and a thimble, a tailor's thimble, the kind that was associated with men who tailor garments. Never knew before that there were different kinds of thimbles for men and women, for example. A woman's thimble is closed at the end and is worn on a different finger than a tailor's thimble, which is open at the end. So encountering those little stories, looking at the skeletons has been fascinating to try to get a sense of who those people were. I've enjoyed very much to try to figure out who they were in life. Dying on Vasa is simply the last and least interesting thing they did in their lives. The challenge for me as an archaeologist and an historian is to figure out what were their lives like before that moment, and what does that tell us. So those are things I've been looking at recently that I've found fascinating. But everything is potentially interesting. I just wrote an article about everything you can learn from a cannonball. And there's a surprising amount you can learn from a cannonball. We have 1,000 of them, but they tell you a lot about the iron industry in Sweden, for example.
Yeah, and that's something that's continued to be an important factor in, well, regional and European politics to varying degrees all the way through to up to and including the Second World War. Yeah. And I must say, as well as you'll know because you were with me at the time, but the ship itself is a magnificent sight. As viewers will know, I've been to Victory and I've been to Mary Rose, I've been to Warrior, I've been to a fair number of museum ships. And okay, fair enough, I've probably been to Portsmouth Dockyard so many times, I just went, oh yeah, there they are. Right. But still, when you come into the hall for the first time and you just see the sheer presence of the ship, especially when you know how old it is, or just how much of a out of time artifact it is, it's a really impressive sight. Even when I've been filming today, going round and round, I think especially every time you get a good view from the bow or the stern at some height, you're immediately struck again by the fact that it's not just a ship, especially in the context of today when a lot of ships kind of look like gigantic rectangular boxes that someone's vaguely shaped a bow and stern onto. But it is also it's a work of art. It's got lines, it flows, it looks like someone's actually spent an awful lot of time and money over it, as opposed to a lot of mass-produced stuff that we see these days.
Well, our head of marketing, because we've been a very successful museum, he often gets compliments or awards and that sort of thing for what he must be doing a great job as a marketing director. And his answer is always the same. He said, the ship does most of the work. It's an impressive object, and what makes it impressive is that it's mostly original. It's 98% original timber from 1628. It's old. It's largely intact, and it's inside a building. If it were sitting at the quay, it wouldn't look nearly as impressive. And the building does a really good job of showing it off when you come in the door. The building was designed there was an architectural competition, and the winners designed this design with the purpose in mind of giving you a massive rush when you first come in the door. That you are confronted by the ship from the best possible angle when you come in the door. And it never fails to surprise people. And I'll be honest, when I come in the door in the morning, even after 17 years of working here, I still get a little thrill every time I see the ship.
Yeah. And on that note, I think we'll conclude the interview portion of the video, although I suspect, given how many times the camera's decided it's reached its half-hour mark and shut itself off, this will probably constitute a greater portion of the video. Yep. So I'll finish off this part by saying thank you very much for your time and expertise.
Oh, sure.
And I will get back to filming elsewhere now and pry this thing off of the Well, you'll be glad to know I was successful in my efforts to dislodge the camera from its little perch in the replica part of the great cabin of the Vasa without, damaging precious museum displays. And there was much more filming to do, much more looking around the museum to do. So this is part 2 of the ongoing series on the Vasa, and there are 2 more parts to look forward to. One part, we're going to go into a detailed discussion of the capabilities of the artillery of Vasa, which you can see here again in another replicated portion of the ship. And then we're going to look a little bit more at what you can see in the museum itself, a little bit more about the crew and the context in which the ship existed. Although obviously, if you want to get the full experience, you do need to go to the museum, so I won't be showing you everything because that would be cheating. But once again, obviously, many, many thanks to Dr. Hocker and the staff at the Vasa Museum who enabled me to make this trip last year. And I hope you've enjoyed it. Because whether you have or not, there's another 2 parts to come, so I hope you're enjoying it, and we shall see you again in another video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.